Welcome to our channel. Before we get started, please consider liking and subscribing so we can bring more stories like this to you.
Harmony Glades. A place for everything and everything in its place. The sun, a benevolent dictator in Harmony Glades, shone precisely on manicured lawns, each blade of Kentucky bluegrass standing at perfect attention. Rose bushes, pruned with geometric precision, lined the sidewalks, their blooms a uniform shade of blush pink. Approved by the HOA. Of course, even the clouds seemed to know better than to linger too long, offering only fleeting glimpses of shade before scurrying on. It was, Agnes Plumtree thought, as close to paradise as one could get on this side of the pearly gates. Agnes adjusted her straw hat, its ribbon matching the exact shade of periwinkle blue mandated for all front doors in the cul-de-sac, and consulted her clipboard. Item number 1. Mrs. Henderson's petunias. They were supposed to be wave purple. But Agnes suspected a rogue easy wave violet had infiltrated the ranks. An abomination. She marched down the sidewalk, her sensible shoes clicking on the perfectly swept concrete. The air, thick with the scent of fertilizer and conformity, filled her lungs. This was her duty, her calling, to safeguard the sanctity of Harmony Glades. It wasn't about power. Not at all. It was about maintaining standards, about preserving the property values that benefited everyone. Or so she told herself. Reaching Mrs. Henderson's prize-winning, and therefore thoroughly scrutinized, flower bed, Agnes bent down, her nose twitching. She murmured, pulling out her magnifying glass. The telltale veining of easy wave violet confirmed her suspicions. She scribbled a note on her clipboard, petunia variance violation notice required, and moved on. Next on the list, Mr. Peterson's mailbox. Agnes had noticed yesterday that it was leaning ever so slightly to the left, the clear breach of Article 7, Section 2, Paragraph B, Subsection 3 of the HOA Handbook. All mailboxes must stand perpendicular to the Earth's surface, with a deviation of no more than 0.5 degrees allowed. As she approached the Peterson residence, she spied Mr. Peterson himself, struggling to install what appeared to be a ramp. A garishly painted, wooden ramp that led right up to his front door. Agnes stopped dead in her tracks, her mouth forming a perfect O of horror. "Mr. Peterson," she called out, her voice laced with a saccharine sweetness that barely concealed her disapproval. "What on earth are you doing?" Mr. Peterson, a kind-faced man with tired eyes, straightened up, wiping sweat from his brow. "Just putting in a little something to help my father get around." Agnes. He's coming to visit next week. Agnes blinked. "A ramp? But Mr. Peterson, you know that any modifications to the exterior of a property require prior approval from the Architectural Review Committee. And frankly," she added, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "it's rather unsightly, isn't it? It completely clashes with the neighborhood aesthetic." Mr. Peterson sighed. "I didn't realize I needed approval for something like this. Agnes. My father can't manage the steps. It's temporary. Just while he's here." "Temporary or not, Mr. Peterson, regulations are regulations. I'm sure the HOA can come up with a more appropriate solution. Perhaps a tastefully disguised lift?" Agnes pursed her lips. "I'll have to file a notice of violation, I'm afraid." That evening, the Harmony Glades HOA meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a faux Tudor building that Agnes considered a triumph of architectural conformity. She sat at the head of the table, her presence radiating an air of quiet authority. Around her sat the other members of the board, a collection of like-minded individuals who shared her unwavering dedication to the rules. The meeting proceeded with its usual agenda of meticulously planned landscaping decisions, heated debates over acceptable holiday decorations, and the occasional complaint about rogue squirrels. Agnes navigated it all with practiced ease, citing sections of the handbook with the precision of a seasoned lawyer. Then came the matter of Mr. Peterson's ramp. "It's a clear violation," Agnes declared, presenting photographic evidence of the offending structure. "It's not only aesthetically displeasing, but it also sets a dangerous precedent. If we allow one ramp, where will it end? Soon, Harmony Glades will look like some sort of institution." She shuddered dramatically. A few murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Mr. Abernathy, the treasurer, raised his hand. "What about the human element, Agnes? His father needs it. Agnes fixed him with a steely glare. Compassion is all well and good, Mr. Abernathy, but we must uphold the rules. Perhaps Mr. Peterson could consider alternative arrangements for his father's visit. There are many fine assisted living facilities in the area. The motion to issue a notice of violation passed unanimously, except for Mr. Abernathy's abstention. Agnes smiled, a small, tight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Harmony had been preserved, at least for tonight. She just needed to make sure the violation notice was delivered immediately. This ramp situation needed to be resolved, and swiftly. The unwelcome ramp, a moving truck, behemoth and out of place, lumbered down Primrose Lane, disrupting the usual Tuesday morning stillness. Agnes Plumtree, watering her prize-winning petunias, narrowed her eyes. New neighbors. Always a gamble. Especially when they disregarded the Harmony Glades moving day restrictions, which clearly stipulated no arrivals before 10 a.m. at IT was only 9:37. The truck parked with a groan outside number 14, its hydraulic lift hissing as it lowered a ramp to the curb. Agnes's watering can clattered onto the paving stones. A ramp? Those weren't permitted. Not without prior approval, architectural drawings, and a unanimous vote by the HOA board, and certainly not on a Tuesday. Agnes watched, a knot tightening in her stomach, as movers began unloading boxes marked law books, judicial robes, and, with a shiver of distaste, medical supplies. The woman who emerged from the cab of the truck, however, wasn't what Agnes expected. She was tall, with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun, and possessed a gaze that could seemingly cut through steel. Agnes noticed the elegant lines of the woman's tailored suit, the way she carried herself with an air of quiet authority despite needing assistance to navigate her wheelchair. Judge Eleanor Reynolds. The nameplate gleamed briefly in the sun as the movers wrestled it into place by the front door. The ramp was a different story. It was metal, industrial-looking, and utterly out of sync with the carefully curated aesthetic of Harmony Glades. Every house had been painted in approved pastel shades, every lawn meticulously manicured, every mailbox adorned with regulation-sized floral decals. This monstrosity was an affront. Agnes grabbed her clipboard, the one she used to document violations. She started with the time. 9:42 a.m., moving day violation. Then, ramp installation without approval. She added a note about the garish, unapproved color, a dull, utilitarian gray. Over the next few days, the construction continued. Agnes documented every clang of the hammer, every misplaced brick, every perceived infraction. The workers, hired by Judge Reynolds, seemed to operate with complete disregard for the neighborhood's tranquility. They left their tools scattered on the lawn, tracked mud onto the sidewalk, and, unforgivably, parked their pickup truck partially on the grass. Another violation. Vehicle parking on non-designated surface. Agnes's blood pressure rose with each infraction. She envisioned the ramp becoming a permanent fixture, a symbol of the neighborhood's declining standards. It would attract riffraff. She was certain of it. People with different needs. Harmony Glades was a place for people who appreciated order and conformity. Judge Reynolds, with her ramp and her flagrant disregard for the rules, threatened that delicate balance. She snapped a picture of a discarded coffee cup outside the Reynolds property line. Littering. Another violation. Agnes drafted a sternly worded letter to Judge Reynolds, outlining the violations and demanding immediate action. She included copies of the relevant sections of the HOA bylaws, highlighted in yellow. She underlined the clauses about architectural approval, noise restrictions, and the imperative to maintain the neighborhood's aesthetic harmony. She sealed the envelope. Agnes felt a surge of righteous indignation. She was doing her duty, protecting Harmony Glades from the encroaching chaos. She would not allow one resident, no matter how important she might think she was, to undermine the years of hard work and dedication that had made Harmony Glades the envy of the county. She dropped the letter in Judge Reynolds' mailbox, feeling a grim satisfaction. The judge may be a powerful figure, but Agnes Plumtree was the guardian of Harmony Glades, and she wouldn't back down. Letters and misunderstandings. Agnes hovered over the keyboard, her lips pursed so tightly they nearly disappeared. Sunlight glinted off the pristine white countertops of her kitchen, each appliance gleaming under her meticulous care, a stark contrast to the eyesore blooming next door. She typed slowly, deliberately, choosing each word like a weapon subject. regarding recent modifications to your property. Dear Ms. Reynolds, she began, saccharin dripping from the cursor. I trust you are settling in well. I felt it necessary, as a long-standing member of the HOA and a concerned resident of our community, to bring to your attention some discrepancies with the recent construction at your property. While we all value improvements that enhance property value, it is imperative that such enhancements adhere strictly to the established architectural guidelines. Agnes paused, rereading the paragraph. Too gentle, she added. The ramp, in particular, seems a rather significant departure from the established aesthetic I have enclosed. For your convenience, a copy of the relevant section of the HOA bylaws regarding permitted exterior modifications. Perhaps a review is in order? She attached a PDF, highlighting sections about uniformity and architectural harmony with a garish yellow. Satisfied, she clicked send. 2 days later, an email arrived in her inbox. The sender, Eleanor Reynolds. Agnes clicked it open with a smug smile, ready to pounce. Subject, regarding recent modifications to your property. Dear Ms. Plumtree. It read, the tone polite, almost apologetic. Thank you for your concern. I understand your desire to maintain the community's aesthetic. However, the ramp was installed under the guidance of, and in accordance with, the Americans with Disabilities Act. I contracted polio as a child, and the ramp is essential for me to access my home. I have also submitted all required documentation to the HOA, including a doctor's note outlining the medical necessity. I hope this clarifies the situation. Agnes scoffed at a doctor's note as if that made it all right. The email reeked of privilege, of someone thinking the rules didn't apply to them. She felt a surge of righteous indignation. She grabbed her measuring tape. Its metallic tang filling her nostrils, back out into the humid Florida air she went. The sun beating down on her tightly permed hair, she marched to the edge of Eleanor's property. Squinting at the offending ramp. It was wider than it needed to be, surely, and the railing was that even. The approved color? She jotted down measurements, noting every perceived infraction in a small, spiral-bound notebook. Back inside, fueled by lukewarm instant coffee, Agnes unleashed her next missive subject, further clarification regarding property modifications. Ms. Reynolds, she typed, her fingers flying across the keyboard now, the politeness shed like a snake's skin. While I appreciate your explanation, I find it difficult to believe that the ramp, as constructed, is the only possible solution. The dimensions appear excessive and the materials used are, frankly, jarring. Moreover, the drainage appears to be inadequate. I observed rainwater pooling at the base during yesterday's brief shower, potentially causing erosion that could impact my property. A complete fabrication, but Agnes felt justified. I must insist that you provide proof of compliance with all relevant building codes and HOA regulations. Furthermore, I propose we schedule a meeting, along with representatives from the HOA, to discuss potential alternative solutions that are less obtrusive. She added, as a final flourish, I am confident that we can find a mutually agreeable solution that respects both your needs and the integrity of our community. The lie tasted bitter on her tongue, but she pressed send anyway. She felt a thrill of control, a sense of purpose. She was doing what was right, protecting her community from this intrusion. The response from Eleanor arrived sooner this time, less than an hour later. The subject line was simply, further clarification regarding property modifications. But the tone was different. The politeness was still there, but it was edged with something else, steel, perhaps. Ms. Plumtree, it began, I understand your continued concerns. However, I assure you that the ramp complies with all applicable building codes, ADA regulations, and HOA guidelines. All permits were obtained, and inspections were passed at AS for your observations regarding drainage. I suggest you consult a qualified contractor before making unfounded accusations. Regarding your suggestion of a meeting, I am available next Tuesday at 2 p.m. However, I must caution you against pursuing this matter. Further, harassment based on disability is a violation of the Fair Housing Act and carries significant legal consequences. Agnes stared at the email, her face flushing crimson. Harassment? Legal consequences? The nerve! This woman, this interloper, was threatening her? Agnes began to draft her next email, her fingers trembling with rage. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. She would fight this, tooth and nail, until that monstrosity was gone. The perfect lawn, the quiet streets, the unwavering aesthetic. She would protect it all, no matter the cost. She just needed to. What did she need to do? She paused. This was escalating. Quickly. Maybe she should talk to Bob. No, Bob would just tell her to let it go. She looked up the Fair Housing Act. Just to be sure. Rallying the troops. The clinking of ice and glasses and the murmur of polite conversation filled the air at the Henderson Heights summer barbecue. Agnes Plumtree, a vision in floral print and meticulously styled hair, moved through the crowd like a seasoned politician, her smile never faltering. But behind the practiced charm, a plan was unfolding. She stopped by Mrs. Henderson's side, making a show of admiring her prize-winning roses. Such vibrant color, Eleanor. Really adds value to the whole street, doesn't it? Agnes paused, then lowered her voice conspiratorially. Speaking of value, I was just noticing some recent alterations on Elm Street. Rather jarring, wouldn't you say, against the established aesthetic. Mrs. Henderson, a woman easily swayed by flattery and prone to gossip, perked up. Elm Street? Oh, you mean with that thing in front of Judge Thompson's house? Dreadful. Simply dreadful. What will the neighbors think? Agnes nodded gravely. Precisely. We've worked so hard to maintain our property values, we can't let them be jeopardized by flagrant disregard for the HOA guidelines. I'm sure Judge Thompson is a lovely man, but rules are rules. She moved on, leaving Mrs. Henderson to fan the flames of discontent amongst the garden club. Next, she cornered Mr. Peterson, a retired accountant obsessed with property taxes. Mr. Peterson, you're such a stickler for detail. I was hoping you could lend your expertise. I've been reviewing the latest property assessments, and I'm quite concerned about the potential impact of non-conforming structures on our collective tax burden. She left the words hanging in the air, allowing Mr. Peterson's naturally suspicious mind to fill in the blanks. Across the lawn, David Miller watched Agnes's calculated maneuvers with growing unease. He enjoyed the neighborhood barbecues, the easy camaraderie, but this felt different, more strategic. That he caught his wife, Sarah's eye and subtly gestured towards the patio table, away from the mingling crowd. Did you see Agnes talking to Mrs. Henderson? And then Mr. Peterson? He asked, once they were seated. Sarah took a sip of her lemonade. Of course, she's been working the room all afternoon. What about it? It just feels off. She's subtly stirring things up. I think about the judge's ramp. Making it sound like it's some kind of threat to our property values. I don't like it, Sarah. The man clearly needs it, Sarah sighed. David, you're always so worried about being fair. That it's a ramp. Honey, that it's not exactly architecturally pleasing. But it's functional and necessary. And who are we to judge? Besides, I spoke to the judge's son. The ramp was built to code. I checked. David, please, just let it go. Agnes is just Agnes. She likes things a certain way. And honestly, she's probably right. It's probably not up to code, and if it's not, then we should take care of it. David frowned. That's not the point. The point is, she's manipulating everyone, playing on their fears and prejudices. It feels wrong. Back on the lawn, Agnes was holding court, surrounded by a small but growing group. I'm not saying Judge Thompson is intentionally trying to devalue our homes, she said, her voice dripping with false sincerity. But we have a responsibility to protect our investment, the responsibility to uphold the standards of Henderson Heights. And frankly, she leaned in closer, her voice a near whisper. What kind of precedent does this set? What's next? Pink flamingos? Car engines on cinder blocks? A nervous murmur rippled through the group. Mr. Peterson nodded sagely. She has a point. A very valid point. Even Mrs. Henderson, usually more concerned with flower arrangements than property values, looked troubled as David watched. Agnes caught his eye and offered him a saccharine smile. He forced a polite nod in return. But a knot of apprehension tightened in his stomach. He had a feeling this was only the beginning. The barbecue, once a symbol of neighborly cheer, now felt like a battleground. And Agnes Plumtree was leading the charge. The notice of violation. The community clubhouse hummed with the cloying scent of potpourri, struggling to mask the undercurrent of simmering resentments. Agnes Plumtree, perched precariously on a folding chair, peered over her spectacles at the assembled HOA members. "This flagrant disregard for procedure must cease," she declared, her voice a tightrope stretched thin. Judge Reynolds seems to believe the bylaws don't apply to her, but rules exist to maintain order. A smattering of nods met her pronouncement, countered by the shuffling unease of others. Thomas Miller, a retired accountant known for his cautious nature, offered a hesitant cough. "Agnes, are we positive? Couldn't we perhaps extend an olive branch? There might be a misunderstanding." Agnes's lips compressed into a bloodless line. "A misunderstanding?" The woman has erected a veritable on-ramp to her front door. The thing clashes horribly with the meticulously cultivated landscaping. The precedent. Soon, everyone will be building willy-nilly. She waved a dismissive hand. "I attempted a conversation, Thomas." She proved resistant. Another neighbor, Carol, tentatively interjected. "But could the ramp be a necessity? I've caught whispers." "Idle gossip is irrelevant, Carol," Agnes snapped. "The bylaws are explicit. All external architectural changes require HOA approval. And this eyesore certainly bypassed that process." She slapped a weighty binder onto the table, sending brochures about perennial care skittering. "I move that we issue a formal notice of violation, demanding the ramp's dismantlement within 30 days. A ripple of discomfort washed through the room. Despite Agnes's relentless zeal, the notion of forcing a newcomer to dismantle something potentially vital felt unconscionable. Even the usually compliant Thomas Miller mustered a protest. 30 days sounds rather severe. Agnes, perhaps consider 60? Agnes impaled him with a glacial stare. 30 days? All in favor? A wavering scattering of hands ascended. Agnes tallied them with dispatch, a flicker of triumph illuminating her face. "The motion carries. Meeting adjourned." Eleanor Reynolds discovered the notice of violation affixed to her front door the following morning. The stark white paper, a jarring contrast against the weathered wood, stung like a deliberate insult. She tore it down, a tremor passing through her fingers. The labyrinthine legal language blurred before her eyes, but the core message resonated clearly. Obliterate the ramp or incur escalating penalties, potentially leading to litigation. A surge of fury coursed through her veins. Yielding to a profound, unsettling despondency, she'd envisioned a clean slate in this community, a haven for safety and self-reliance. Instead, she was being singled out, judged, and penalized on account of her disability. Retreating inside, the notice clutched in her hand, she sank into the comforting embrace of her favorite armchair. The sunlight, once welcoming, now seemed harsh and judgmental. This wasn't merely about a ramp, it was a battle for acceptance, for dignity, a fight for the right to exist without justification. The following afternoon found her ensconced in the meticulously appointed office of her lawyer, Sarah Chen. The air hung heavy with the scent of aged volumes and supple leather. Sarah, a polished, impeccably dressed woman in her late 30s, listened with focused attention as Eleanor recounted the events. "And they're demanding its removal in a month's time?" Sarah queried, her brow knitted. Eleanor confirmed, the lines etching themselves deeper around her mouth. "The absurdity! They haven't even attempted to learn about my medical circumstances." Sarah tented her fingers thoughtfully. "Discrimination predicated on disability is a grave offense, Judge Reynolds. The HOA's brazen disregard for your needs could constitute a breach of the Fair Housing Act. We possess multiple paths to pursue." Eleanor leaned forward, a spark of resolve igniting in her eyes. "I intend to contest this, Sarah. I refuse to be coerced into concealing my disability or further complicating my life to appease their aesthetic sensibilities." Sarah's lips curved into a confident smile, a predatory gleam dancing in her eyes. "Excellent, because I believe our case to be robust. Initially, we shall dispatch a letter to the HOA, delineating the legal ramifications of their actions and insisting upon the rescission of the notice of violation. We will underscore your standing as a respected jurist well-versed in the law and the court system. Subsequently, we will assess their response. Should they remain intransigent, we shall explore more comprehensive legal measures. This could become quite unpleasant for them, Judge. Exceedingly so. The judge's hammer The air in Mr. Abernathy's sanctum reeked of aged paper and expensive leather. A gold pen tapped a nervous rhythm against a mountain of files, each one a chronicle of Eleanor Reynolds' tribulations. Sunlight poured through the towering windows, igniting the dust mote's aerial ballet, a stark contrast to the simmering anger within the room. His voice, a measured baritone, filled the space as he dictated to his secretary. To Ms. Agnes Plumtree, president of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. We have become aware that you, in your capacity as president, have subjected our client, Ms. Eleanor Reynolds, to a persistent campaign of badgering concerning the construction of essential medical modifications to her residence. This endeavor, justified by purported breaches of HOA regulations, appears pointedly directed at Ms. Reynolds due to her physical challenges. He paused, adjusting the knot in his silk tie. Moreover, your office seems ignorant of Ms. Reynolds' distinguished career. Let the record reflect that Ms. Reynolds is, in fact, the Honorable Eleanor Reynolds, a judge of the Superior Court and a lifelong champion of disability rights. His voice took on a sharper edge as he continued. Your actions, Ms. Plumtree, flirt dangerously with violations of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Intentionally impeding a disabled individual's access to their home, founded on discriminatory enforcement of HOA rules, invites significant legal consequences, including, but not limited to, severe financial penalties and potential civil actions. We strongly advise you to immediately cease and desist from any further actions directed against Ms. Reynolds. We await your prompt confirmation, in writing, that you will comply fully with this demand, coupled with a public apology to Ms. Reynolds for the anguish you have inflicted. Abernathy leaned back, the click of the gold pen a punctuation mark. Send it certified, return receipt, and Mary, he said, turning his gaze toward his secretary. Include a coda, something with teeth. Remind her that judges are intimately acquainted with courtrooms, professionally and, should the need arise, personally. Across town, Agnes Plumtree was coddling her prize-winning petunias, a light melody tripping from her lips. A staccato rapping at the door startled her, causing a shower of droplets to cascade across the immaculate patio. A delivery man in uniform stood holding a manila envelope. Registered mail, Miss Plumtree. Your signature, please. Flustered, Agnes scribbled her name and seized the package. Retreating to the serene haven of her sunroom, she sliced it open with a decorative letter opener. The initial paragraphs swam in dense legal jargon, a miasma of official-sounding platitudes that barely registered. Then, the words Eleanor Reynolds leaped out, followed by, Judge of the Superior Court? Agnes gasped. She scanned the line again, her eyes flitting nervously, as if hoping the words would rearrange themselves into something less alarming. Judge? Eleanor Reynolds? The woman with the ramp? It was inconceivable. This had to be some kind of error, a ridiculous, lawyerly excess. She skipped further down, her eyes snagging on Americans with Disabilities Act in bold, a frigid knot clenched in her solar plexus. Harassment? Discrimination? These were hideous accusations she had never imagined directed at her. She, Agnes Plumtree, bastion of Willow Creek's aesthetic order, guardian of its bylaws, a discriminator. The notion was preposterous. The postscript, rendered in elegant italics, landed like a stinging slap. Please understand that Ms. Reynolds possesses substantial legal acumen and will pursue every available recourse to safeguard her rights. The letter fell from Agnes's grasp as if electrified, her meticulously cared-for nails bit into her palms. This couldn't be real. That it was a hideous joke, a bureaucratic nightmare. She began to pace the sunroom, the skirt of her floral sundress whispering against the tile that it was all a misunderstanding. All she'd done was try to uphold the values of the neighborhood. She was simply enforcing the code. But the letter's pronouncements echoed in her skull, amplifying her dread, the vision of Eleanor Reynolds, seated in her wheelchair, her expression an enigma, burned in her mind. A judge, a real, influential judge. Agnes had anticipated a minor skirmish, a civilized disagreement, perhaps a sharply worded letter from the HOA's own, more affordable attorney. Not this. She retrieved the letter, her hands trembling violently, her face felt hot, her throat constricted. This was no longer about a ramp. This was about litigation, penalties, public disgrace. The carefully crafted facade she had erected, The image of the unimpeachable community pillar was poised to shatter. She slumped into a wicker chair, the cushions offering scant comfort to her burgeoning panic. The cheerful sunbeams flooding the sunroom now felt like harsh spotlights, accusing her. Agnes Plumtree, champion against architectural affronts, had just wandered into a legal quagmire, and the gavel was about to drop. Divided glades. The azaleas seemed to bloom overnight, their vibrant pink a stark contrast to the simmering discontent that had taken root in Harmony Glades. Whispers, carried on the gentle breeze that rustled through the meticulously manicured lawns, replaced the usual friendly greetings. Agnes Plumtree, it seemed, had poked a sleeping bear, and the whole community was feeling the tremors. "Did you hear about Eleanor Thompson?" Marge Hemlock asked, feigning interest in pruning her prize-winning roses while simultaneously grilling Sarah Klein across the picket fence. "Apparently, she's some kind of judge, and she's threatening to sue Agnes." Sarah, usually eager for gossip, just sighed. "I heard about the ramp, too. Seems a bit harsh, doesn't it? Agnes going after her like that." The story, embellished and twisted with each retelling, was spreading faster than crabgrass. Some pitted Agnes, painting her as a victim of an overzealous newcomer. Others, recalling Agnes's past battles over mailbox placement and garden gnome regulations, felt a flicker of satisfaction. Most, however, were simply worried. Lawsuits meant rising HOA fees, and no one wanted to pay for Agnes's crusade. David Miller sat at his computer, the glow illuminating his face. He'd initially dismissed the ramp as an eyesore, agreeing with the general sentiment that Harmony Glades needed to maintain its harmony. But after hearing the whispers, seeing the almost gleeful vindictiveness in Agnes's eyes at the last HOA meeting, a nagging feeling of unease had settled in. He typed ADA accessibility regulations residential into the search bar. The results were overwhelming, a dense thicket of legal jargon and case studies. He spent hours sifting through it, his initial annoyance giving way to a growing understanding. He learned about reasonable accommodations and undue hardship, terms that had previously been abstract concepts. He saw pictures of ramps seamlessly integrated into landscapes, proof that accessibility didn't have to mean aesthetic sacrifice. He discovered that discriminating against someone based on disability was not just impolite, it was illegal. The more he read, the more uncomfortable he became. Agnes, in her relentless pursuit of conformity, might have stumbled into something far more serious than a simple code violation. The aroma of brewing coffee filled the air, but David barely noticed. He was too engrossed in a landmark case involving a homeowners association and a visually impaired resident. The HOA had refused to allow the resident to install tactile paving, arguing it violated the community's uniformity. The court had ruled in favor of the resident, citing the association's failure to provide reasonable accommodation. He rubbed his tired eyes. He wasn't a lawyer, but the parallels were undeniable. Judge Reynolds, he consciously corrected himself, using her proper title, clearly needed the ramp. Was Agnes willing to risk a lawsuit and potentially bankrupt the entire community over a few feet of treated lumber? His phone buzzed. A notification from the Harmony Glades HOA. He hesitated, then clicked it open. Subject: Emergency HOA meeting. Due to recent events and growing community concern, the email read, "An emergency meeting of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association will be held this Thursday at 7 p.m. in the community clubhouse. Attendance is strongly encouraged." David sighed. The gloves were off. He knew Agnes would use the meeting to rally the troops, to paint Judge Reynolds as a disruptive force threatening the very fabric of Harmony Glades. He had to do something. But what? He wasn't sure he had the courage to stand up to Agnes, not with her network of loyal supporters, but the thought of staying silent, of allowing her to railroad Judge Reynolds based on ignorance and prejudice, felt even worse. The aroma of the coffee, now cold and bitter, did nothing to soothe his churning stomach. Judgment Day. The community clubhouse throbbed with restless energy. A hive stirred from slumber, chairs stuttered against the floor as neighbors jockeyed for position. The air, thick with a humid blend of anxiety and barely suppressed animosity, carried a whiff of day-old coffee and thwarted ambitions. Agnes Plumtree, perched precariously on a table's edge near the front, gripped her manila folder like a lifeline, knuckles bone-white. Her gaze, a nervous hummingbird, flitted across the faces before her, a tremor of genuine apprehension in her eyes. A few rows back, David Miller busied himself with his phone. Hours spent poring over ADA statutes had softened his initial outrage at Eleanor's ramp. Agnes's ironclad adherence to the HOA rulebook now struck him less as principled governance and more as something unseemly, something born of spite. Eleanor Reynolds entered with quiet grace. The soft whir of her motorized wheelchair cut through the murmurs as she moved through the crowd. Her lawyer, Ms. Chen, a woman with features honed to a razor's edge, at her side, conversation evaporated as she reached the front. The resulting silence felt almost palpable. "Good evening," Eleanor began, her voice amplified and steady, resonating with quiet strength. "I understand there are concerns. Regarding the ramp I recently had installed." A sharp sound escaped Agnes's lips, her complexion mottling crimson. "Concerns? It's a flagrant violation. It's an eyesore, devalues the neighborhood, and Eleanor raised a hand, cutting Agnes off with a subtle yet undeniable authority that even surprised David. "I understand your position, Miss Plumtree, however. I believe it lacks a fundamental element, compassion." She paused, letting her words resonate. "For decades, I've lived in a world not built for me. I've encountered hurdles, both physical and in attitude, that are beyond the comprehension of some here. This ramp isn't about aesthetics. It's about necessity. It's the bridge between isolation and participation." Eleanor's gaze drifted, connecting with individuals across the room. "We all claim to want a welcoming, inclusive community. But true inclusivity goes beyond lip service. IT demands action, understanding, and a willingness to adapt, even when others' needs diverge from our own." Ms. Chan stepped forward, placing a neat stack of documents on the table. "Moreover," she said, her tone precise and professional, "we have cause to suspect that the discriminatory enforcement of HOA regulations aimed at Ms. Reynolds' ramp constitutes a violation of the Fair Housing Act. Ms. Plumtree, you've consistently disregarded numerous other infractions within this community: overgrown lawns, unauthorized paint schemes, even a dilapidated toolshed constituting a safety hazard. Yet, you zeroed in on a ramp that provides accessibility to a disabled resident." Agnes's face began to fall apart. "That's not true. I address violations as they're brought to my attention." Ms. Chan arched a brow, a steely glint in her gaze. "Indeed? Perhaps you can explain this, then." She held up a photograph, a crisp, detailed image of Agnes's rose bushes, planted directly against the sidewalk, a clear breach of HOA Bylaw 3.4 regarding obstruction of pedestrian traffic. A wave of murmurs rippled through the audience. David noticed several heads nodding in agreement. He'd nearly tripped over those damned roses himself countless times. Agnes sputtered. That's different. Those are decorative. Decorative and in contravention of HOA rules." Ms. Chun countered smoothly. "And this," she added, presenting another photograph, Agnes's overflowing recycling container, left at the curb for 3 consecutive days. A violation of Bylaw 6.11. And this, she continued, each piece meticulously documented, eroding Agnes's carefully constructed image of propriety. The room was quiet, punctuated only by the whisper of paper and Agnes's increasingly labored breathing. David watched as Agnes's carefully constructed world fractured. He saw raw fear flicker in her eyes, the dawning recognition that her deeds carried consequences. A twinge of something akin to pity stirred within him, quickly followed by a wave of relief. He had been complicit, initially, taking Agnes's side without fully grasping the context. He had been blinded by his own preconceived notions. Eleanor, her voice a calm harbor in the brewing storm, spoke again. "My goal here isn't to punish Miss Plumtree, it's to educate and build a more accepting community. I believe we can all derive a lesson from this situation." The HOA board members squirmed. The president, a stout man named Mr. Henderson, cleared his throat nervously. "Well, thank you, Ms. Reynolds, Ms. Chan, we will take this matter under advisement." He avoided Agnes's gaze shortly thereafter. The meeting dissolved, leaving Agnes alone, clutching her manila folder, the weight of her actions crushing her. The facade of flawless order she had labored to maintain lay in ruins, replaced by a bitter aftertaste of shame and regret at a more harmonious future. The air in the community hall hung thick and still, almost a physical presence. Agnes, positioned at the head table, its polished surface reflecting the harsh fluorescent glow, felt the throb behind her eyes intensify. The room overflowed, every seat claimed, neighbors lining the walls like silent judges. Even David Miller, usually a reliable ally, wouldn't meet her eyes. The vote arrived quickly, a guillotine blade point. One by one, HOA board members, those she had considered confidants, even intimates, cast their ballots. The motion to nullify the violation against Judge Reynolds sailed through without dissent. Agnes felt a chill creep through her. Then came the mea culpa. A formal statement, delivered by a newly appointed secretary, confessed to the lapse in judgment, the lack of sensitivity, the potential breach of federal law. The words echoed, each syllable chipping away at Agnes's carefully maintained facade. What followed felt inevitable. David Miller, his voice tinged with a remorse that rang hollow, nominated Agnes's replacement as HOA president. She didn't offer a fight. What was the point of resistance? The room tilted precariously, the atmosphere dense, and her own voice felt distant, untrustworthy. The vote was, again, unanimous. She was ousted. Agnes observed, detached, as her successor, a young woman named Sarah, an active volunteer at the local disability center, assumed her seat. Sarah's first order of business was to propose funds for ADA-compliant renovations throughout the neighborhood. Starting with the sidewalks surrounding the park, the motion passed, met with a wave of applause. Eleanor Reynolds sat in the rear, her wheelchair placed discreetly. She'd remained silent throughout the meeting. Yet her presence resonated. Agnes chanced a glance. Eleanor caught her eye and offered a subtle nod. It wasn't triumphant. Simply acknowledging. The meeting concluded, the room emptying with haste. Agnes remained, alone at the head table, the mahogany now a cold, unforgiving plane beneath her touch. Shame stung, a bitter taste in her mouth. David approached, his brow furrowed with concern. Agnes, he began, his tone laced with hesitancy. I'm so sorry that I truly didn't. Agnes silenced him with a dismissive gesture. Just go, David. He departed, leaving Agnes alone with her spiraling thoughts, a storm of anger, humiliation, and a burgeoning awareness. She pictured Eleanor, the ramp she had so vehemently opposed, the countless instances when she had dismissed accessibility concerns as needless or burdensome. Later that night, Agnes found herself driving past Eleanor's residence. The ramp, illuminated by the gentle porch light, no longer seemed an offense to the eye. Instead, it seemed purposeful, indispensable. A freedom. She imagined Eleanor utilizing it, seamlessly entering her home, her life. For the first time, Agnes entertained a perspective outside her own. She contemplated the people she had inadvertently excluded, the obstacles she had unconsciously erected, the rules she'd enforced, so meticulously, so rigidly, now felt flimsy, devoid of compassion. The weight of her choices pressed down, heavy and stifling. She had been so preoccupied with upholding the image of the community that she had overlooked the fundamental requirements of its citizens. She had been so focused on preserving her own sense of order that she had sowed discord and division. The next morning, Eleanor discovered a note tucked beneath her windshield wiper, brief, handwritten, and without a signature. I understand now, it stated. I apologize. Eleanor smiled, a genuine, wholehearted smile that lit her eyes. She rolled herself down the ramp and into the sunlight, the cheerful sound of children at play drifting in the air. The community was imperfect, but evolving, learning, perhaps becoming a more welcoming place. The next HOA meeting, Eleanor addressed the board and the community members present. I appreciate the changes being made and the efforts to create a more inclusive community. But let's not stop here. Her voice was clear and resonant. Let's make this the new standard. We have an opportunity to show everyone what it means to be a welcoming and accessible community, and I intend to work with all of you to make that happen.